Hey, thanks for checking out my painting. It's just a quick lesson today. We're going to create a tonalism style painting with a very limited palette. And I'm going to do so in my oil painting journal that I created out of a pad of watercolor paper that I just worked my way through, first by applying some basic white gesso to the pages, letting them dry, and then painting over them. Right now what I'm doing is just marking in the halfway points on both the vertical and horizontal axis. And I'm basing this painting on a painting prompt that I found on one of my favorite Facebook groups called Tonalism. There was somebody generously on that group shared a photograph and offered it up as subject matter that folks could practice their painting on. So that's what I'm using. And for my palette, no need to worry about remembering this. It's a short list, but I'll also include a detailed list in my notes of materials and my palette. I'm going to use mostly yellow ochre and burnt umber. I'll also use a very wee little bit of sap green, some white, and a little bit of red. It doesn't matter what kind of red you use. So what I've done is I've laid in a little bit of an underpainting or a wash of almost pure yellow ochre out of the tube. And mind you, this is a study, so I'm doing a little bit of experimentation with the concept that I'm hoping to create within this painting. Again, it's based upon a photo, but I am editing the composition and I'm also adjusting the colors. My aim here is really to do very little color mixing and use very few pigments. So now I'm putting in some burnt umber, which will represent the shadows within the foreground and some of the midground. And what I'm doing is using a very worn out, inexpensive hardware brush that's actually, I think, on the verge of retiring. I think I paid maybe $3 for it. So, the total cost of this exercise really is going to be very minimum, or very minimal, based upon the fact I'm using paper, based upon the fact I'm not using my very best paints, and I'm using an inexpensive brush. So what I'm doing in this painting, I'm putting in a little bit of a hint of there being some sort of thicket of weeds and sticks and reeds. And little cattails will be jutting out from this massive brush. It'll take a while to get to that point. What I'm doing now is really focusing on creating the bigger shapes and some of the textures. So you can't quite see it because it's off screen, but this is going to be a snow-covered pathway. So what I've done is I've rolled up my paper towel, and I actually made a mistake right there. I didn't create a fine enough point in my paper towel roll. I'm trying to carve in what will be a hint of this pathway or roadway kind of bending to the left and to the right and shaping the edges of those areas on the sides of the pathway. This is a snow-covered path, so the shadows there will consist of an off-white kind of consistency. And I'm using the paper towel just to cover what will be the shape of the pathway, the general shape of the pathway. And just smearing in some of that burnt sienna and yellow ochre actually together with some white. And I'll come over and reshape the midground and the foreground, and look to create additional textures, hoping that in the end it'll resemble what look like tall reeds and grass. Using that same old cheap brush. You can see I flipped the brush around and I'm looking to use it to create a little bit more of a solid line. Not really worried about creating a perfectly straight line. Not really worried about the potential for any mistakes at this point. Because just like with almost every painting we start, we're going to start with the shadow patterns or the darkest patterns. And we want some overlap between the edges of the different shapes. Because it does help create some depth and some interesting effects in the painting. So right now you can almost see with the tint on the pathway there, it almost looks like we might be walking through some sand with some snow on it. I'll come back later and I'll brighten that up and look to create some textures that resemble maybe wheel tracks and maybe some footprints. What I've done here is I've added a little tiny bit of sap green to burnt sienna. And I'm just looking to bring some hints of green grass, maybe that isn't so dried out. Maybe it represents different plant life other than the reeds that are sticking out. And in this picture, we're not going to be able to see the video all the way to the end. I ran out of time, and you'll see the sky will ultimately be unfinished, and then we'll fade into what's the finished painting toward the end. There'll be a little bit of a hint of a red sky along the horizon. But right now I'm really focusing on creating those textures within the shadow patterns on the sides of the pathway. And I'm doing that because I just want to show how simple and easy it is to create that effect. Now I'm mixing up some white. I'll include at various points a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of burnt umber. I'll add some green, sap green. And I might go through this after it dries with a little bit of ultramarine blue as well, just to create some variance in the shadows within the snow on the pathway. But for now, in this video, what you see is what you get. It's mostly white with a little bit of yellow ochre and or a little bit of burnt umber mixed in. And a lot of the mixing I'll do right on the painting itself. So I am painting alla prima, wet on wet. And I'm trying to use the textures as much as I can to create the illusion of perspective as well. And you can kind of see that develop a little bit now and again while I'm painting. And there's some of those ripples in the snow intended to maybe create the illusion of there being some tire tracks and some footprints, just scuffing it up. What's interesting about painting on this surface, watercolor paper, it's essentially watercolor paper or gesso, is there in most cases there's just not a lot of tooth, not a lot of texture, so the paint really slides around almost as if you're painting on a gessoed board. And you do really need to consciously and intentionally work at creating textures with the paint, because you very, very easily could just have perfectly smooth application and paint could even slide off from time to time. But what we're doing here is really practice. So if anything like that should happen, we really don't mind. And here is the final painting. You can see the red background that I mentioned. I appreciate you watching. Sorry for the poor quality here in the editing, but I hope this is helpful in some way, and I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for checking out my video. Have a great day.